Another challenging week for Prime Minister Rishi Sunak saw one of the party's red wall champions defect to reform, a row over a Tory donor's racist comments, and a further flurry of speculation about an imminent challenge from within for the leadership of the Conservative Party. Can Sunak really survive in Downing Street until the autumn, or is a summer election now inevitable? Also in the news this week, the news. Ofcom have tickled GB News over breaches to its rules and regulations. The row over the future ownership of the Telegraph and the Spectator has gone nuclear, and the press has been criticised in some quarters at least for its recent coverage of the royal family. What's happening to the mainstream media in the UK, and is the local and regional media industry dead? Welcome to the Downtown Den Politics Podcast.
Just looks like bigoted woman.
Me and my friends sort of used to run through the fields of wheat.
You turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
It will cost.
I know words, I have the best words, but there's no better word than stupid.
Okay, well, I'm delighted once again to be joined by, as ever, our political commentator here at Downtown in Business, Jim Hancock, and of course, Joe Phillips. Joe, a former advisor to Paddy Ashdown, the Liberal Democrat leader, and also to Bob Geldof. I will get into a conversation with Joe at a forthcoming conference that we are hosting on the 18th of April in Liverpool, Changemakers Live, about what that was like being an advisor to such high-profile guys. So yeah, we'll find out a lot more about that, as I say, in our conference next month. But let's start with the continuing psychodrama of the Conservative Party and the continuing woes of the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, because no sooner had the dust settled on the budget, didn't seem to me to have the sort of reset and renewal of the government that Jeremy Hunt was hoping for, that budget. But he then got himself embroiled in all sorts of controversies, one of which, and we'll start here, the decision of Lee Anderson, up until recently a vice chairman of the Conservative Party, of course, didn't really cross the floor, did he? Became the first member of Parliament for reform. So I'll start with you, if I may, Joe. What did you make of Mr. Anderson's decision to go into the party that I would suggest was his natural home, really?
Well, I should think there are a lot of Conservative members breathing a sigh of relief. I mean, I think what it tells you is why on earth did Rishi Sunak have such a bad error of judgment to appoint Lee Anderson in the first place as a vice chairman, and why didn't he get rid of him earlier? I mean, he was only had the whip withdrawn because he refused to apologise about comments he'd made about the London Mayor Sadiq Khan being in the clutch, if you like, of Islamists, which was utterly ridiculous. But he'd also, if you remember, and I'm not going to swear because, we know that nice people are listening to this podcast, but he actually said in an interview, he said in an interview with a national paper that asylum seekers who were being put on the barge, the Bibi Stockholm and other barges, while their claims were being processed, if they didn't like it, they could F off back to France. Well, if that's the language that you think is appropriate for a politician and the vice chairman of a Conservative Party, then there's something very wrong with your judgment. And I think it says more about Sunak than it does about Lee Anderson. I mean, he's no great loss. He's just an empty vessel that shouts a lot. And I think you could say the same for, Sunak's appointment of Suella Braverman. I mean, they're certainly punching above their weight, but they've got, and I know we'll come on to this later, they've got pretty guaranteed coverage at the moment on GB News. They've got their president, Nigel Farage, they've got their leader, Richard Tice, they've got one of their parliamentary candidates, Ben Habib, all cropping up with amazing regularity. But whether that actually translates into seats come the election, we'll have to see.
My view of Rishi Sunak is, I've said this before, he's not a politician, and therefore his instinct on these things is always lacking, in my view. And not only was it poor judgment to appoint Lee Anderson to such a high-profile position as vice chair. I think it does demonstrate his desperation to try and manage an unmanageable party. But nevertheless, it was a risk that I thought was not necessarily required, and certainly one that's backfired. But then if we move on to the other row that emerged last week over the donors' comments regarding Diane Abbott. Listen, I, again, no big fan of Diane Abbott, but the comments that are attributed to the donor basically were Diane Abbott makes him sick, makes him want to hate all black women, and she should be shot. Now, in whose head, Jim, is that comment not racist and misogynistic? But again, Sunak, as he tried to do with Anderson's comments regarding Sadiq Khan, initially sent his troops out to say, no, this isn't racist, it's just wrong. It just, as I say, he lacks all political instinct for me.
It was a rerun of the problems that Boris Johnson got into, where he was sending out his spokespeople to defend the indefensible over things like Chris Pincher. Do you remember that? And then changing tack. And nothing demoralizes a party more than when they take a line which is indefensible. I mean, watching the spokespeople trying to say that, you know, you actually want somebody to be shot and it wasn't racist, and or that it was a racist comment. I heard a black representative of the Conservative Party saying that although they said these things and they were racist, it didn't mean the person was racist themselves. You know, trying to make these distinctions is just taking the public for fools. I mean, the fact of the matter is, and it's, as I wrote in my blog last week, there were two parallel cases of this. The fact of the matter with Azhar Ali, the Rochdale candidate, was for 48 hours, the explanation was, oh my goodness, we haven't got a candidate for the by-election. That's what the delay was. The case with Frank Hester is, oh, 10 million quid, you know, oh, we can't afford to lose that. Nobody's fooled by this sort of thing. And the Prime Minister, as you say, doesn't have those political instincts to nail it immediately. I mean, we don't want to get in a situation of instant judgments. You know, I'm not saying everybody off with his head and so on, but when it's quite clear cases that we had with Azhar Ali and Frank Hester, the hesitation is almost worse than the offence.
No, I agree. And I think that to compound his difficulties, of course, the budget that was previewed as the reset for the government, and we were going to have this tax cut. Jeremy Hunt was going to announce this amazing package of economic measures, which were going to shift the dial as far as the polls were concerned. And lo and behold, by the weekend, the Tories are down at 18% in some polls. And of course, then what emerges is a flurry of rumour and activity suggesting that Sunak could and should, in some people's eyes within the Tory party at least, be removed as the Prime Minister, and we should have a fourth Prime Minister in this Parliament. And yeah, that's like Chelsea getting rid of managers, really, isn't it? And it does strike me, actually. It's a bit like fantasy football, isn't it, when you're a Conservative member of Parliament at the moment? It's like, well, we'll give them a couple of goes, you know, we'll give them a conference speech and we'll give them a couple of budgets. And if it doesn't work out, we'll sack them and move on to the next person. But again, Joe, I have to say, you know, Sunak has not done himself any favours. I think partly as a result of that lack of political judgment, but equally, that budget just didn't at all hit the mark, did it? Didn't break through anywhere. Nobody saw that as being something that was going to be a pre-election giveaway. And equally, the other thing I thought it did very helpfully for Labour was it gave Rachel Reeves lots of get-outs when she's being challenged over where you're going to find the money for this, where you're going to find the money for, and she says, well, listen, this guy, the Chancellor, talk about unfunded commitments. He wants to do away with national insurance altogether. So, of course, then all that happened last week was Hunt was backtracking on that particular remark, saying, oh, well, that's just, you know, it's an ambition over many parliaments. Well, you know, it's a nonsense, isn't it? But a very poor budget. But again, Sunak unable to even keep his party on message as far as the economy was concerned, because he's getting railroaded every other day by these controversies that are emerging.
Yeah, I mean, I personally don't think he can hang on until the autumn. And I think, you know, if they get a bad set of local election results in May, which we may come on to later, I think the clamour for him to go will become ridiculous. I mean, personally, I think, you know, it would be the utter, but it wouldn't stop them, act of complete and utter self-delusion to think that the Conservative Party could foist upon us yet another Prime Minister. If he was going to go, we'd have to have a general election, which is why I don't think it'll last till September, October. But you're absolutely right, Frank. He hasn't got political instincts. The budget had been leaked and leaked and leaked. The national insurance cut is not going to make a scrap of difference to most people, because we're all being brought into by the fiscal drag, the higher rate of income tax, and everything but everything. You know, your house insurance, your phone bill, your car insurance, all of those day-to-day things, and the cost of living is all going up. Train fares are going up, have gone up. So, you know, 400 odd quid from national
and council
insurance
tax, Joe.
make it,
Everyone's
yeah,
council tax.
Absolutely. Well, mine's virtually doubled in the last 5 years, and my income hasn't. So the national insurance thing actually it's not worth it. It wasn't worth the effort. I mean, I think, just to go back to your point about Rachel Reeves, the one slight surprise, I think, in the budget, and there weren't many, was the non-doms thing, which of course was a Labour policy. And in a sense, I think Jeremy Hunt was trying to play a game to box Labour in. But I think Rachel Reeves is far too smart. And I think, more importantly, you know, because they've been in opposition for 14 years, the Labour front bench have been doing the hard yards. They're not people who've come into Parliament, you know, a couple of years ago and whoops-a-daisy, it's your turn to be Minister of this in the afternoon, and oh, you'll be something else in the morning. They're working with business. And I think businesses are not buying this nonsense from the government. You know, what business needs more than anything else is some sort of certainty and some sort of consistency. And, you know, while Hunt may have thought, oh, this is clever, this is electioneering, or box Labour in so they haven't got any room to move, the Labour Party are far too smart for that. And business actually just want a little bit of security and stability.
Absolutely. You know, we did a big property festival in Cannes last week in France, and I'm looking at you and Jim now, waiting for the sympathy to come through the screen. The thought of me having to go through that beautiful city for 5 days. But of course, there were lots of business people in and around the festival who were saying exactly that, Joe. You know, well, it's time for a change was basically the phrase that you just heard over and over again. And that's from people who ordinarily, I would suggest, majority of whom would be Conservative voters. But they're fed up with the psychodrama. They're fed up with the uncertainty. And I totally agree with Joe on this, Jim. I find it absolutely incredible to believe that Rishi Sunak could survive until the autumn. The rumours just keep coming. There's lots of manoeuvres taking place within the Conservative Party itself, with people jockeying for position. You've got Kemi Badenoch desperate to not have a leadership election this side of a general election, because a leadership election this side of a general election, on the basis that she thinks it'd be far better for her to get rid of Penny Mordaunt, who's likely to lose a seat at the forthcoming election, and giving her a sort of clear run as far as she's concerned. But there are other names emerging that we might come to. Do you think Sunak can survive, though, Jim?
Well, I just wanted to ask Jo to clarify her position, because she seems to suggest that the Tories have a really bad local election. They don't change their leader, but they're forced into a general election in the summer under Rishi Sunak. I mean, that seems like a recipe for sort of electoral suicide.
No, I don't think she was saying that, was she? She was. I'll let you explain. Sorry.
Well, I think if you want to have a new leader of the Conservative Party, you know, and there are many in the Conservative Party who do want that. You know, if you have a bad set of elections in May, which I think is probably a given, then Rishi Sunak has got the opportunity to say, OK, I don't have the confidence of my party. I'm going to stand down. But you go to the country with a new leader. You cannot just impose another leader, another prime minister on us. I think there would be, well, I would like to think there would be absolute outcry, because it's disgusting. It's an affront to democracy.
So Sunak would say, I'm resigning, and then there'd be a Tory leadership election immediately followed by a midsummer.
There wouldn't be a Tory leadership election, Jim.
Right.
There would not be a leadership election.
Okay, crowning of a new leader, and then an immediate general.
And they would be, they'd immediately have to call her. I'm absolutely with. Or at the very most, they could drag it out to October at the most.
But then
get party conferences out the way. But I think Joe's right. I think people will be so outraged by the idea of a third unelected prime minister coming into 10 Downing Street. They would have no alternative but to simply get a new leader in situ, perhaps give them 4, 5, 6 weeks to get a manifesto together, and I think a lot of Conservative MPs actually would think they could still stand a better chance in those circumstances of holding the seat than they would if Sunak remained as Prime Minister. I just can't see him surviving, Jim. I don't know how you think he can. You explain to us why you think Sunak can continue to, on a weekly basis, have to manage what is clearly an unmanageable party, but worse than that for him, an unmanageable party that has zero respect for the guy.
He's relying on the economy improving. There are some figures coming out, I think, tomorrow, which he hopes will show an uptick. It looks as if the Rwanda bill the Lords are going to cave in on that. So he will start to deport people to Rwanda in the summer. And he'll be...
But will he, Jim? Because again, I'll just go back to Robert Jenrick's comments only a few weeks ago, which said that this bill has so many holes in it that as soon as you try and put someone on a plane, which, I mean, again, we could argue, I think us three are all on the same page as far as the Rwanda policy is concerned. It's an absolute nonsense. But even if he gets the bill through Parliament, is he going to be able to get people on the plane?
Well, no, I was just trying to paint for you the scenario where he, despite a bad local elections, he is hoping to get people on the planes. He's hoping that the economy picks up. You can see that they're reaching for all sorts of levers. I'm not saying that they're game changers at all, but with the budget not having worked, they've now made announcements about these low vehicle neighbourhoods, football regulator. They're reaching for everything they possibly can, and I think that's how Sunak will continue to perform throughout the summer, saying you cannot subject people to another unelected leader. I'm carrying on with the prospect of a September financial statement, which I think will be extraordinarily reckless. I mean, it'd probably be a 2p income tax cut to completely salt the earth for the incoming Labour government, and that's my. I'm just having a discussion here. I'm just trying to put a counter argument. That's why I think and politicians do not want to go, but you may be right. The grey suits do turn up.
No, I think the problem sorry, Joe. I think the problem he's got, Jim, is that if you are facing oblivion, and many Conservative Party MPs now think that the P45 is sort of written, then the last throw of the dice is to get rid of Sunak, a man who was not supported by the party membership. So there is no enthusiasm from the troops back in those Conservative associations when MPs are returning back home. They're being given, I'm sure, an awful lot of stick from their local activists, some of who will be saying, if that guy's still in charge, I won't be delivering your leaflets, pal. And then you've got people who, as I say, very clearly ambitious and who see taking over now and saving at least some Conservative seats gives them an opportunity of a revival in the next Parliament. At this moment in time, if these polls are anywhere near correct, they are facing a wipeout worse than 1997. And I would have said to you even 6 weeks ago that I thought that those polls were a little overly pessimistic for the Conservatives. But what I've seen over that period of time is the Conservatives in meltdown. So I as I say, I can't see how he could survive until the autumn.
Well, and also the other thing, Frank, is that, you know, we talk about Rwanda. It is not top of the list of what ordinary people, ordinary voters are thinking about. They are worried about income. They're worried about the health service. They're worried about schools. They're worried about housing. You know, whatever happened to levelling up? Did somebody sort of leave that out for the rubbish? You know, there's nothing that they're doing and nothing that they have done has made anybody feel any better. And even if the economy does improve, you know, and we've seen inflation come down, and we're probably edging out of a mild recession, but we haven't got, as we said just now, the stability for economic confidence and investment that we need in order to drive productivity and for people to create jobs and keep jobs. I mean, you know, there is so much uncertainty and people are really struggling. People who are working but on low wages, who are spending such a chunk of their money either on transport or on rent, they're never going to get out of that cycle. And all the time businesses are so unsure about investment and problems. And the other thing about the summer, you know, I'm talking to you from Kent. I'm about 20 miles from Dover, and I would put money on it that there will be long queues backwards and forwards across the channel with a lot of extremely disgruntled holiday makers and drivers because of the extra delays because of Brexit. And, you know, we're obviously being close to Dover, we're very close to the channel. Every time the weather improves, there's another load of boats come over, which again is not top of most people's agenda, although there are certain factions that would like it to be so. Meanwhile, you know, can you get an appointment to go and have diagnostic treatment? Can your kids go to school and they're not in a porta cabin wondering if the ceiling's falling on them?
I think this is his big problem, nailing colours to the mast as far as Rwanda is concerned, Jim, because we know there is going to be a spike in boat crossing during the summer. Whereas he can point to reduced numbers at the moment, that is at least in part due to the fact that we've had inclement weather, and therefore you're not going to have as many boat crossings. It also has something to do with the deal that he did with, was it Bosnia, I think? Albania. Sorry, Albania. And you know, a policy, by the way, that Labour have been saying that's the policy that we should be pursuing, but with other countries across Europe. So I think the Rwandan policy, totally agree, actually, again with Joe. I'm sorry, Jim, because it sounds as though we're ganging up on you here. I know that you're trying to, in a sense, put the alternative view, and I guess that there are people within the Tory party. There've been Liam Fox last night saying we would be absolutely mad to change leader at this point in time. But I just do sense that the Conservative Party 2024 is of a different vintage from that we've been used to in the past. And they panic, they do daft things, their judgment, we say Rishi Sunak's political judgment isn't great, but I don't think the Tory party collectively has good political judgment these days. And I think the other thing that they will be fearful of is the return of Farage. Because again, if you look at Reform's polling, OK, Anderson, I tend to agree with Joe. I think that will be a sort of storm in a teacup. I don't think he's got the sort of profile that a Farage has. But if Sir Nigel does step back into the ring, then that's going to be a further problem for Sunak, Jim.
Yes, it certainly would be. I do slightly differ from you both about the issue of immigration. I do think that it explains why Lee Anderson was made deputy chairman of the party, because he had a certain resonance with people in the north who are concerned about this.
Even your clock doesn't agree with you, Jim. Saying you've gone cuckoo. We're all ganging up on poor Jim today.
A lot of Conservatives were grassroots Conservatives were very unhappy about the way Anderson was treated, which shows you a fundamental direction of the party, I think. So, that's why I think Sunak is clinging on to Rwanda. I agree with you about the effectiveness of it. I mean, it's going to be trivial in terms of the numbers. But I just think if he can get the planes, or it does slightly throw it back to Labour. I mean, they're hoping to say to Yvette Cooper, and I listened to her, and I'm not frankly convinced that Labour have got an answer to all this. So if they can make that a wedge issue, that's the point I'm making.
Yeah, and I'm sure they will try and do that, because it's one of the few things where they can potentially say, look, that Labour haven't got a plan. They keep trotting this phrase out, don't they? And then robbing Labour's policies, which seems a bit ironic. But I just can't see how immigration cuts through when you've got so many other issues. And we had this conversation last week, Jim, didn't we? Where in polling that I've seen, NHS is sort of number one, cost of living, housing, there's a whole range of things now. And immigration's coming in as about number 8 or number 9 as an issue. Whether or not that becomes more of a concern as those boats start to cross, of course, it may do. But I think if I was a Labour or opposition politician, every one of those flights, I'd just be putting a price tag on it, because it is going to cost us like literally tens of thousands of pounds for every one person that we deport to Rwanda. And don't
forget, we're taking people back from Rwanda.
And we're taking back from Rwanda. And if you start to say there's 3 cancer operations just got on that flight, there's 2 schools that could have been repaired just got on that flight, that's the, I wouldn't be frit if I was Labour over that particular policy. I would see that as an opportunity. And equally, I think the problem that Sunak has, let's take your premise, Jim, that he does survive. Here's the big problem for the Tories going into the next election. Who's going to be the Prime Minister in 2025? Because it ain't going to be Rishi Sunak. Even if Sunak won that election, it is clear that he does not have the support of the Conservative associations in the country or the parliamentary party. So if he manages to squeak through somehow and win an election, how long would he survive? Who are you actually going to be putting into 10 Downing Street? Again, great messaging for Labour, I think.
Well, it's a it's a strange assertion that you make, that the man who, well, I mean, if Sunak actually pulled off a Conservative victory now, I would suggest to you that he would be hailed as a miracle worker and would have as long as he likes as Prime Minister.
Well, no, he's just taken them from an 80-seat majority to, at best, I would say, a coalition with who, God knows who.
That's a different thing.
Going to. He's not going to win. But, as I say, if I was a Labour strategist, I would be saying, vote for Sunak. Yeah, I don't know. I'd probably say Braven, but whoever. There is no way that even if he did survive until the next election, I doubt whether he can. There's no way he survives much after that, even if they squeaked into some sort of coalition agreement with some other party.
We shall see.
I think the comments from Ben Wallace, the former Defence Secretary, should be the things that the Conservative Party listen to, which is, there's a point in a battle where you have to walk towards the sound of gunfire. And actually, they might as well. There's so many MPs are standing down. But, you haven't even got people in constituencies who've been there for ages and ages who might get back in because they've been a really good constituency MP. A lot of these people are going. So a lot of Conservative voters are voting for an unknown. And are they moving further to the right? The Conservative Party need a time in opposition because it's important we have a good opposition, but they need to recenter. And pardon the pun, but that's what they need to do. They need to stop being frit of Nigel Farage and Reform and George Galloway and everybody else who's of the extremes, and actually think about what they want to do for the country instead of the last 14 years, which is what they want to do for themselves.
Now, if Joe and I are correct, James, and there is that leadership, I would say appointment rather than election, my money would be on Priti Patel for several reasons. One, she's kept her powder dry. She's not been one of those people who've been running around trying to destabilise Sunak, at least publicly. She was actually one of the few MPs who came out almost immediately calling Simon Clarke's letter asking for Sunak to resign as total nonsense. And she remains very friendly, of course, with the hero of the Conservative Party, Boris Johnson, who many in the associations believe was totally undermined by the establishment, whatever that is. She is also, let me remind you, somebody who once advised Nigel Farage when he was, it wasn't the Reform Party back then, it was something else. It wasn't UKIP either. But anyway, what was the other name that they had, Joe? Can you remember, Jim?
Brexit. The Brexit
The Brexit Party, they had Reform. Anyway, she was an advisor to Farage at one point, or a researcher for that party. So she's got, she'd get Johnson behind her. I think she'd get GB News behind her. So my money's on Priti Patel. Joe, who would you see emerging as a potential sort of caretaker prime minister to take the Tories into the next election?
Well, the one who I think would be the best, actually, and she should have got it the last before the leadership election.
So many of them
would be Penny Mordaunt. But as Jim said, I mean, she's quite likely to lose her seat. But she is sensible. She is straightforward. She's got that political instinctiveness that you talked about earlier, Frank. And she's a good person. She's an interesting person, got an interesting background. I've known her for a very long time. And I think she would be ideal. But of course, her leadership campaign was completely destroyed over transgender something or other. I think by Kemi Badenoch.
Yeah.
So, I mean, she's probably not in the running unless she keeps her seat. I mean, who else is there? It's sort of like, well, which of these rotten apples would you like to pick that isn't going to be quite so squishy?
James, who would your money be on?
This is for if Sunak throws in the towel after the local elections. I mean, this is an interesting point because, in a sense, it's a poison chalice. But I presume we're sort of saying that whoever took it would take the view that they were going to be the leader in the opposition, that they wouldn't just take this job on for a short time and then they say, oh, look, you lost us the election. The understanding would be, look, I inherited an almost impossible position. I now need time as leader of the opposition to sort things out. Otherwise, nobody's going to touch it. They're going to be kicked out immediately afterwards. Although, obviously, if it was Mordaunt and she lost to the Lib Dems, I imagine they're the challengers in her seat. The thing would have to be reviewed. Well, no, we are talking about a lot of women. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? In Labour, you struggle to see who the woman leader is going to be. Although I've had a very good information that Rachel Reeves and Angela Rayner seriously consider themselves as future Labour leaders. I'll just throw that into the mix. But we've got Badenoch, Braverman, Patel, and Mordaunt. I think Braverman is. Kemi Badenoch's quite interesting because she forced the Prime Minister to take a stand against Frank Hester. I mean, this was the humiliation for Sunak last week, that while they were humming and hawing about whether to call it racism, she felt emboldened enough that Sunak was weak enough that she could say it is racism, and the Prime Minister has to follow on behind. So she's clearly a determined woman, but she comes over to me as quite arrogant, not necessarily a team builder. Mordaunt, I agree, is probably, there was a lot of talk in the papers at the weekend that the left of the party and the right of the party were sort of coalescing. The right were prepared to say, OK, we'll go along with Mordaunt. And then I'm very interested in what you say about Priti Patel. I mean, she has had a checkered record as Home Secretary. She had to resign once because she disclosed something. But I don't suppose that matters with the grassroots. I think it's there's four women there. It's quite unusual in British politics. All contenders. I think this is one of the problems, of course, that I don't think we can be sure of any of them, and that, in a sense, is a deterrent of this business about, is it a coronation? It better be a coronation, because if it's a leadership election, It could be quite messy, quite tight, quite indecisive. Someone just wins. That's what Sunak is clinging on to. You know, après moi le déluge, as General de Gaulle used to say.
There is. Well, you're taking me back to Cannes now, James. Listen, at the end of the day, we will see what emerges. Who knows? We always say this, but it's so true, isn't it? Particularly these days. A week is a long time in politics. This time next week on the podcast, we may be saying, "What a fabulous revival for Rishi!" People have rallied around him. The economy is improving. And 99 people have been put on a plane to Rwanda. So we will see what we see. But yeah, I'm going for Priti Patel. Joe, I think more in hope than expectation, penny Mordaunt. And I think sneakily, Hancock has really got his money on bad enough, but he'll never ever get off that fence. His Liberal Democrat splinters are always up his arse. Listen, we're going to go
Nothing wrong with those.
a short break, and let Jim go and sort that cuckoo clock out, and we'll be back in a mo.
Hi, my name's Frank McKenna, and I'm here to tell you about Downtown in Business's Change Makers Live conference, which takes place at Liverpool's Spine Building in the city's Knowledge Quarter on Thursday, the 18th of April. We've got some fantastic speakers, including the head honcho of Capital Incentric, Tim Heatley, the disruptor developer. We've got Rose Marley coming along to join us. She is the Chief Executive of Cooperatives UK. And we've got Joe Phillips, who is the former advisor to Paddy Ashdown and Bob Geldof. Quite a couple in there. Anyway, come along and see some fantastic speakers, not just those three, some other excellent contributors to Changemakers Live 2024. That's on the 18th of April, Liverpool. Book your tickets now on the link below.
Welcome back to the Downtown Den Politics podcast. Delighted this week to be joined by, as ever, Jim Hancock and Joe Phillips. And before the break, we were talking about Rishi Sunak's woes. In this part of the podcast, we're going to be talking about the news being in the news. And I'll start with GB News, which is a channel that's caused much controversy since its launch a couple of years ago. It's financed, bankrolled by a guy called Sir Paul Marshall and others, I think. Has a range of presenters, Nigel Farage, Richard Tice. We've had Lee Anderson now, I think, gets a good chunk of cash to present a programme on there. And then you've got others, such as Rees Mogg. Up until recently, Esther McVey and Philip Davis, Tory MPs, were presenting a programme. And this week, Ofcom, perhaps belatedly, came out and said, not really a great idea for a news channel, which deems itself, by the way, as an entertainment channel, allowing sitting politicians to be presenting the news, as certainly Esther and Phil did, and perhaps some of those other presenters have as well. Now, to declare an interest, I have been a fairly regular contributor to that channel. Certainly when Esther McVey and Philip Davis were presenting their Saturday morning and indeed Friday morning programmes at one stage. And I took the view that you couldn't criticise the channel for being unbalanced if you then simply refuse to engage with it, and therefore used to go on a regular basis. And I always found two things, actually. The staff at GB News are hugely friendly, very hospitable, always fed me with a decent breakfast and got me good coffee. And I found most of the staff actually who work for GB News to be nearer my politics than some of the presenters, if I can put it that way. Don't want to be getting anyone into trouble here. But also, I then found that there were other people of my sort of political persuasion, if you like, who used to appear regularly as well. One of whom was Joe Phillips. And Joe, you just give me your sort of sense of the whole GB News thing.
Well, a bit like you, Frank. I mean, I'm a regular participant on various programmes, and I just took the same view that you can't criticise something and you can't say it's dreadful, I don't agree with what they stand for, if you're not prepared to be part of it and you're not prepared to be willing to put your side of the story. I mean, I think, it punches above its weight for sure. I think if we put it into context, because Talk TV, funded by Rupert Murdoch, has closed down or is going to close down. Piers Morgan's gone off to YouTube. It's going to close. Now, they both, Talk TV and GB News, both were set up at the same sort of time. Talk TV spent an absolute fortune on superb, fabulous studio facilities in London. GB News went on the air and it was a bit like Acorn Antiques. It was wobbly. There were people wheeling around, cameras that looked as though they were going to topple on them. They didn't know if they were on the air half the time. And don't forget, it started with Andrew Neil, who we were talking about earlier. Mercifully, you might say, there's only a limited number of people who want to watch rolling rants. And actually, GB News had cornered that market by the time that Talk TV then actually went to air. And they've got, big name presenters, you mentioned Farage and Rees-Mogg and various other people. I think the biggest problem it faces, and a part of the problem that I think Ofcom is maybe not been as assiduous as it might be. It calls itself GB News, but actually it's an opinion channel. It's not a news channel, although it does have, news readers and it has reporters and things, but it's not a news channel like BBC or Sky or Al Jazeera. And I think that the problem comes that when you have got presenters who are not journalists, they haven't got that instinctive feeling about balance. So, I can find myself on a programme with a presenter and another guest, it's 2 against 1. Whereas in, traditional broadcasting, the presenter would be in the middle and go, well, hang on a minute, Jim's got a point, or hang on, Frank, let's hear what Joe's got to say. And I think that lack of journalistic nuance, if you like, has made them perhaps not as balanced as they might be. I mean, I think the other thing that this is a personal thing, I don't think people on social media who are anonymous, I don't think you should count their views. In the old days, you'd write to the local paper or the national paper and you could have name and address withheld, but you still provided it. Back in the Middle Ages, when I used to produce phone-in programs on radio, you always took the person's telephone number and called them back to make sure that they were real. Yeah. Nowadays, you've got this sort of deluge of people who can call themselves anything they like. You don't even know if they're human. They could be bots. And I think that slightly skews the sense of, again, that non-journalistic presenters, that what they're saying is true. And I think that lack of journalistic curiosity, the lack of wanting to find out if something is as it appears, slants its coverage. I mean, I don't think it's bad at all. And I think it's important that there is a mix of voices, and it is certainly fulfilling something. But I do think we need to be careful about truth and accuracy. And I think that's where GB News might fall down.
Jim, I know you'll have a view on this because, the former BBC journalist yourself, you were in a position of real influence as the political editor of Northwest BBC News. And at one point, very powerful voice within that particular station. But equally, you were well aware of your responsibilities in terms of balance. As Joe said, as a journalist, you had to be right down the middle, and woe betide if you weren't. You get some right stick, mate, wouldn't you?
Yes, yeah. And this really goes to I'm just broadening this out a bit. We have a decision to take in this country. I mean, in the United States, starting with radio, they deregulated radio in the 1980s, and this led to the explosion of shock jock radio, where highly opinionated, usually on the right. I mean, we might want to talk about that. It's generally the right seem to have exercised their freedom in the United States. They're not aware that there are powerful Democrat channels and things like that. It's an interesting phenomenon. And now, of course, you've got Fox News in America, and sadly, in my opinion, CNN, which I've always liked and continue to cling on to, because they were so traduced by Trump, have become an anti-Trump network. So there's a polarization there, and we have a decision to take in this country, because I'm a little confused. I mean, I always thought that GB News was explicitly, giving an alternative voice. I always thought it was shamelessly going to take a more right-wing position than the BBC, ITV, and Sky. But then you've got Ofcom, but they are under the Ofcom umbrella. And Ofcom is clearly straining at the leash, to deal with this sort of new phenomenon of GB News. They haven't fined them or anything. They've sort of wrapped them over the knuckles a bit here. But, we have a decision to take in this country. Do we want to not abandon, but do we want a whole series of shrill, opinionated, and, as you say, happy to take on board the wild west of social media and sometimes portray it as fact? Do we want to go down that route, or do we want Ofcom to really crack down on GB News and treat them in exactly the same way as Sky, BBC, and ITV?
Well, I think in terms of Ofcom, I don't know so much about what did you call it? A slap on the wrist, or what was the phrase you used?
Yeah, it was
more like the knuckles or something.
Yeah, it was more like a tickle on the tummy, Jim. We agree. This is the problem, isn't it? I think Ofcom, they get very exercised when it's the BBC. But whenever it's an independent organisation, far less so. And I do think that it's time for us to reform and review the regulations in and around media, not least because of the point that Joe made. Social media now, such powerful influence in people's thinking, to the point where my 10-year-old daughter was flicking through her iPad the other morning and tells me that Queen Camilla wants to take over the royal family. It's like some news that had come through on a channel. My 10-year-old's a bit more interested in things like that than she ought to be. It's a dad's fault, probably. But the social media influence, I don't know how you begin to tackle that as a government, as a regulator. But Ofcom itself needs a bit of a shake-up, I think. And the point I'd make back to you, Jim, is I absolutely take your point in terms of where GB News is, and they have this very blatant view that it's right-wing generally. To say they have people like Joe and I on to try and balance things out. But increasingly, you have BBC journalists deciding that they're going to articulate opinion. Back in your day, that would never have happened. And Laura Koonsberg has been caught up in this in the past, one or two others. So I'm not sure the BBC itself these days is seen as impartial as it once was.
No, I agree. I think it was a huge mistake when they made it almost a performance management issue for how much BBC correspondents engaged in Twitter. This is a few years ago, before the real toxicity set in. But I could not understand how journalists could maintain their impartiality once they started to engage with people on Twitter. And I think that was a huge mistake. I mean, the BBC's got to guard its impartiality with great care. Otherwise, one of its main pillars of justification at a time when the question of the license fee and how it's funded is beginning to loom up again. I've in recent days, talking to some MPs at Westminster last week, there is concern about the BBC's coverage of Gaza. This particular MP was very concerned that it was very, very pro-Palestinian. So that is a precious thing that the BBC needs to guard. But I think they let their guard down when they let their correspondents engage in Twitter. I think it's been pulled back to some extent recently.
And Robbie Gibb has just been reappointed as a governor of the BBC. He was former advisor to Theresa May and Boris Johnson. So, again, we point to GB News, but at least they are sort of in plain sight, Joe.
Yes, there is that. But my fear is always that there are people, whether it's your 10-year-old daughter or whether it's a 45-year-old bloke, wherever you get your news from or however you get it, you have to be in the position to think and believe that it is true. And given the, speed with which news changes, I mean, Jim and I will remember the days of you did the lunchtime, you go to 6 o'clock, and if you were lucky, you might get something new for 10 o'clock. But it wasn't on a rolling basis like it is nowadays. Yeah. And so news is changing. Nobody's got time to read the thought pieces. Nobody's got time to read the analysis, if indeed they want to. And I think the problem is that, if it's on the telly in the corner of your living room, you think that is a fact. Now, whether that is somebody coming out with absolute garbage about, vaccines or COVID or immigrants or something else with no verification, it's dangerous. And the problem is that, unless we give people the tools to say, hang on a minute, I mean, in a way, this sort of takes us on to Kate Middleton and the royal photographs. Where did that come from? When was it taken? Can you verify that those people that you see chanting and waving flags and shouting awful things, was that where you said it was, or is it something that happened years ago? Well, none of us, apart from people like me and Jim, have the time or the interest to do that. And I think because we are deluged with so much information, it's really important that we know what we can trust. And I think Jim's point about the BBC is absolutely true. I mean, the BBC is a strange beast. It's trying at all times to be all things to all people. And, I'm sure I'm not alone in thinking, can you not keep advertising bloody BBC sounds and podcasts, whatever happened to making programs? And, there are all sorts of arguments, but you've had a government over the last decade or so that has also lammed into the BBC and accused them of being lefty, biased and all the rest of it, because they've tried to be balanced, whether it's over Brexit or over climate change or anything else. But, for my money, I think the licence fee, I'm happy to pay. I would happily double it just for people like Lise Doucette and Jeremy Bowen. And I think we have to remember that the people who go into places like Gaza or Sudan or Will Grant, who's in Haiti at the moment, they are actually in huge danger, but they are bringing us the truth that only organisations like the BBC will do, because they will verify it. They're not going, and this is what somebody said on Twitter, this is what somebody saw on their phone. They will verify it. And it's really important, never more so in my view, that we have that trust.
And that leads me on to ownership of the media. And Sir Paul Marshall, as I mentioned, is a big benefactor to GB News. I think he's the major shareholder there. He's put a bid in for the Daily Telegraph and the Spectator, arguably the two most influential news sheets that Conservative Party members and the Conservative Party members of Parliament take their sort of lead from. And there's some legislation that the government have come up with suggesting the foreign ownership in future of newspapers and media in this country will be outlawed. That is partially as a result of an American who used to be at CNN, Jim. His name escapes me at the moment. I may be able to find it on my phone. I'll go onto Twitter and see if I can find it, Joe. But that his bid has been backed by UAE, which has obviously caused some consternation within the corridors of power, and been very roundly criticised by the existing editor of the Spectator magazine, Andrew Neild, who Joe knows as from her past life as a journalist. And again, I have to say, I think Andrew Neild is fairly clear in terms of what his political views are. But whenever I've seen him perform as a journalist, as an interviewer, has been impeccably impartial. Indeed, Boris Johnson refused to do an interview during the general election campaign. So fearful was he of the interrogation that Andrew Neild would put him through. So Andrew Neild has sort of said this will be a disaster for the Telegraph, for the Spectator and the wider media in the UK. Conservative governments have come up with legislation which won't go through until after the next election. I do have to ask, what would be the difference, and you may be able to answer this, Jim, it's a genuine question, between foreign ownership from UAE and Rupert Murdoch, who was Australian, and got an American passport, but as far as I'm aware, was never a UK passport holder. So is it just people from the Middle East we don't want running our media? Is that what the Conservatives are saying?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. This distinction about foreign ownership, as if we're putting a stake in the sand now, and everything previously was British owned. I mean, Rupert Murdoch has dominated the Times, the Sun,
the News of the World,
the News of the World, since 1969 when he first came to this country. So the past has been sold, in my opinion, on foreign ownership in that way. Now, but we come, as you've already hinted, what we come down to is a concern that, Rupert Murdoch may be a foreign owner, Australian or American as he is now, but he broadly shares our values. So there's not an issue there. The issue with this is that the United Arab Emirates and its policies on gays and on executions and all that sort of thing would infiltrate the Daily Telegraph. Now, as far as I've followed these tortuous negotiations, the would-be takeover from the UAE, they tried to promise that the editorial panel, people who actually write the stuff in the Telegraph, would be completely independent from the United Arab Emirates itself. But I'm not convinced by that. I cannot see that in the longer term, there might be an attempt originally, but everybody who worked for the Telegraph would know to go soft on certain stories and that sort of thing. And I can't imagine that the Telegraph will be waging campaigns like, all papers did, asking questions about when the World Cup and all this sort of stuff goes to that part of the Middle East. I'm not convinced that the barriers would be there. So we may be, in honesty, ought to be redefining this debate as saying that the government are taking action against the ownership from the Middle East, not foreign ownership, where I think you're quite right. The past was sold when Rupert Murdoch, if you want to be pristine about that, when Rupert Murdoch was allowed to own the Sun in 1969.
What I would say is that I think it's a further indication that we do need to reform and review the laws governing our media, because as much as I absolutely agree with the point you made, Jim, about the EUA's views on LGBT issues, for example, I would be equally offended by the views of Sir Paul Marshall in terms of immigration, if some of the things that have emerged about some of his retweets and things that he's liked on social media are true. Who decides what a fit and proper person is to own a newspaper? It's a little bit like a fit and proper person owning a football club, isn't it? I know you were keen to get onto that subject, Jim, but we're not going to do that this week. But Joe, it is such a minefield. And again, I think that the point that you make about social media leads me into this nonsense about what we've been reading and hearing rumour-wise in terms of the royal family, because I sense that mainstream media now feel as though they've almost got to keep up with the social media, the Twitters, the Facebooks, the Instagrams. And the only way they can do that is sort of buy into some of these rumours themselves. And it's a dangerous place that we're in, Joe.
Yes, it is. And I think part of the problem, I know everybody blames everything on cuts, but if you look at the cuts to resources in newsrooms, whether that's television, radio, local papers or national newspapers, you haven't got the reporters and the staff to go out and get the stories themselves. So you are very much reliant, as we were saying earlier, in the fast-moving media of today, that somebody's got some video footage on their phone of something that's happened, so you'll use that or you'll buy it. And what is a story? I mean, certainly if you look at things like the London Evening Standard or the Metro, for instance, and the Daily Mail particularly guilty of this, there's a row. Well, the row is a Twitter storm. Well, a Twitter storm, frankly, is what we used to call a storm in a teacup. But because a lot of people who've got too much time on their hands are absolutely furious and they say, we must lay off Kate, while there's 39 pages of was that Kate at a farm shop in Windsor or what's really wrong with her? You get into this sort of vortex, if you like, that they need something new to refresh it. They haven't got the reporters to go and do it. So they're using crap, frankly, that's coming from ill-informed people who may not even be anywhere near or have anything to do with it and don't know any more than my cat. And so it creates this viral circle, if you like, and it's not a virtuous circle for sure. The American you were thinking of, I think, is Ken Griffin.
Yes. Yeah.
And just to go back on Jim's point about Murdoch, of course, he transformed television, B Sky B, which then became Sky News. And I think, there was all sorts of concern then. But, legislation will never keep up with technology, and it doesn't understand technology or media. And I think that's a problem. But if you're talking about ownership, frankly, do I care about the Telegraph? No, I care more about who owns my water company or my train company. And we've sold off all of those things to China and Russia and various other parts of the world, including the UAE. And those are parts of our basic, national infrastructure that nobody seems to kick up about.
That's a great point, Joe. Great point. Jim, why are the media after the royal family, or are they?
Well, it's very interesting, this business about the interaction between social media and the conventional media. I just make the observation that we are aware of all the highly distasteful and speculative comment that's going on social media about the Duchess of Cambridge. And the conventional media, I've felt over the last week or two, have been straining at the leash. They refer to this without actually mentioning. Even the newspapers have been restrained, as far as I can see, about actually putting the speculation in the public domain. I mean, it appears that I'm pleased to say the Princess of Wales' appearance at the farm shop allays a lot of that nonsense. But there's always this tension, this referencing by the conventional media of what's going on social media, and I feel it's almost an invitation to people to go on, those who haven't, to see what's actually going on, even though it's not necessarily going on.
The Russian media reported yesterday, by the way, true story, this, that King Charles had died. It's just incredible, what is going on at the moment.
But I haven't answered your substantive question, which I'm not sure I quite think that they're sticking the knife into the royal family. I think I've seen some quite sympathetic things, because all of a sudden, the fragility that they are human beings has been displayed. The Queen died, Charles has got cancer. Kate's obviously taking her time to recover from an operation, and Harry's not available, and actually, so the slimmed down monarchy that was once regarded as a long-term policy that Charles would implement has rather been advanced by events. So I think generally there's a bit of anxiety actually about the royal family at the moment, the continuity of it, and. I think the press would be very unwise. I think most people regard, the Princess of Wales has clearly gone through a rough time. She's done her best with the photograph, which all went horribly wrong, and will be sympathetic to her. I don't think at the moment that it is the right approach to stick the knife in. I mean, there is some frustration that the Kate and William want to keep their family private, and we understand all the historic reasons for that. But the problem is that balance, that they need to be accessible, but they want to keep their family to themselves.
Yeah, be better, I think, if Andrew stayed out of the news. But listen, we could spend a long time on the royal family, but more of interest to me, at least, is an issue that Joe raised when we were talking about how we were going to put today's podcast together. And you sort of intimated at this, Joe, but it's that lack of resource, and it's having a huge impact on local newspapers, regional media output as well. I referenced BBC Northwest, which Jim used to be the editor of. There's also on the Independent channel here, a news magazine programme. They have so dumbed down those programmes now that Certainly, I don't watch them anymore. I'm not sure whether the BBC North West Tonight has a political editor anymore. But local newspapers, Joe, are really struggling, aren't they? And, there's a couple of weeks going out of business now.
Yeah, it's awful. And, this is a week when the government has come out, clutching at straws again, saying local councils must consult with residents every time they propose a new low transport zone. Well, local councils do. But, the rules have changed on all sorts of things like planning, for instance. Once upon a time, it had to go in a local paper for 28 days. Now you only have to tell the people who are directly on either side or opposite a planning application. You can't make a horse go to water or take a horse to water, whatever the phrase is. And the loss of local newspapers has a huge impact, I think, on local democracy, because you don't get the reports on council meetings, you don't get the reports on court cases and coroner's inquests and things like that. And so you actually are reliant very much on social media or people within your neighbourhood who are on social media to tell you about, hey, did you know they're going to plan to build this here, or they're going to do this there, or whatever. And it's a slow process, because if you want to take part in that democratic process, you've then got to go online and get in touch with your local council. Local newspapers and local radio, particularly, I did quite a lot of BBC local radio, which is where I started my career about 3,000 years ago. But, it's really, really important, because it's stuff that doesn't get covered. I mean, we've spent quite a lot of today's podcast talking about ownership of national media. We've talked about GB News. We've talked about the royal family. But the reality of life is that people need to know about things like changed bus routes. They need to know about changes to rubbish collections. And as councils are more and more under pressure to cut things, it's really important that they keep in touch with their communities. Now, if you haven't got that organ of local press, you've lost that gateway, if you like, to every front door or library, or, whether it was a free sheet or whatever. But I can't see how they survive. I mean, Jim and I were talking earlier, and I think he knows more about this than I do, but I think it's really encouraging to see that there is a growth of community newspapers in some parts of the country. I think Liverpool's got somewhere, Manchester, Bristol, I think, and Birmingham. And I think that's really, really good, because we need to have that local voice. Otherwise, people become completely voiceless. And so when the government says rather stupidly, councils have got to consult, well, how? How do you do it, short of spending money on sending a letter to everybody, because not everybody's digital?
Yeah, absolutely. And Jim, I know you'd echo Joe's comments, particularly about BBC local radio, which again has been decimated in recent times.
Yes, it has, and that is worrying. The combining of programs during the middle of the day, and you get a huge region instead of your local thing. That is reprehensible. I want to defend regional television, though. Annabelle Tiffin is my successor as BBC North West political correspondent. Granada TV recently won a Royal Television Society award for one of their reporters who did a magnificent documentary on the 50th anniversary of the Summerland fire. And the audiences at 6:30 combined for the 15 nations and regions is bigger than for the sort of peak time viewing of a drama. So I think regional television is still there.
That's good to hear, Jim. That's good to hear.
The big worry is local newspapers. They're getting thinner and thinner. They're getting more and more expensive. I continue to buy newspapers, but I am bombarded all the time by those newspapers with an invitation to go online and read it online. You really think that some high-level decision is almost being taken in this country, that as soon as they can phase out physical newspapers, particularly at a local level, they will do so. And then we are... And also, in terms of local government scrutiny that Joe's mentioned, the local government correspondents, Gerald Brown, and people like that, people in Liverpool, what was he called?
Liam Thorpe.
Yeah, well, no, but I'm talking about going back along. There were some really distinguished...
previously.
Yeah. Really, really good correspondents who got to know the complexities of local government and reported on it. They have disappeared. the counterbalance is, yes, there are community papers, Joe, but the replacement to some extent has been things like the Mill in Manchester, Liverpool and Manchester Confidential. You can go on there and see sort of coverage and so on, but it's obviously, you then come to the reliability issue. And it's such an important time because local government, I don't know if anyone watched Panorama last night, local government is in a massive crisis.
Yeah.
And, it provides the services that we all need. And, to have a lack of scrutiny at this time is very worrying.
Yes, it's a conundrum that I fear will not be solved, no matter how much regulation may be introduced and reform to media ownership. Those local newspapers are really struggling, and I am challenged to find a solution to that, I have to say. Maybe it is through these independent community publications, as Joe said, but often they are digital as well. And again, as Joe made the point, not everybody goes online for their news. Anyway, we can't solve everything on this podcast, but what we can promise you is that we'll be back again next week. We'll see what this next 7 days has to bring in the world of business and, more importantly, as far as this podcast is concerned, politics. It's been great to be joined by Joe Phillips, who's now going to go off and do a million interviews, GB News, local radio stations, whatever else she has planned for today, whilst Jim goes and puts his feet up in the garden. This is Frank McKenna, the Downtown Den Politics podcast presenter. Thanks to Chris Wilcox, as ever, our producer as well. We'll be back next week. Have a great 7 days, whatever you're up to. Thank you.